Okay, so it's my very great pleasure to give you a warm welcome to the inaugural annual lecture of the Warwick Interdisciplinary Research Centre for International Development. Before I go any further, can I just ask Maeve to confirm that you can hear my audio correctly?
Yes.
Thank you so much. So of course it's our, I'm sorry, but there's an echo. Is it possible for everyone to mute their microphone? Thank you so much. So of course it's a great pleasure and an honour, in fact, to host Professor Mahmood Mamdani today. He's going to be talking to us about his latest book, Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities. My name is Briony Jones. I'm the Co-Deputy Director of the Warwick Interdisciplinary Research Centre for International Development, or WICID as we like to call ourselves, along with Oyinlola Oyebode, and we work with our director Shirin Rai and our administrator Maeve Monahan. So welcome from all of us. Just a few words on WICID, which was established in 2019 with the aim of addressing urgent problems of poverty and inequality, and to bring about social, political and economic change on a global level through our research and impact work. Our current research themes deal with, but are certainly not limited to, gender, peace, conflict and justice, mobilities and health. And through our methods lab, we've created open access resources which are designed to advance pedagogical innovation, as well as our research and impact work in the fields in which we work. So as you will have seen from Maeve, who posted in the chat, we are recording the session today and we will post it on our YouTube channel. We may use images and clips or social media for our publications. So if you don't wish to be recorded, of course, your videos are off anyway, but you can use the chat function to ask your questions, and you can let us know if you do not wish to be recorded. Now on to introducing our three honourable speakers today. First, of course, we're hearing from Professor Mamdani, who's the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government and Professor of Anthropology and Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies at Columbia University, Director of the Makerere Institute of Social Research in Kampala. His work, of course, rarely needs an introduction, but he's the author of Neither Settler Nor Native, which we will be hearing about and discussing today, as well as Citizen and Subject and When Victims Become Killers. Thank you very much, Professor Mamdani, for being with us today. We will then hear from two discussants. Firstly, Dr. Teodora Todorova, who's an independent researcher and teaching fellow based at the Department of Sociology at the University of Warwick. Her research is concerned with grassroots activism and transnational civil society responses to gendered and racialized power and state violence. She also has a forthcoming book, Decolonial Solidarity in Palestine-Israel, Settler Colonialism and Resistance from Within. And then we'll be hearing from our second discussant, Dr. Randolph B. Persaud, who's Associate Professor of International Relations at the School of International Service, American University, Washington, D.C. He works on race and international relations, critical political economy, human security, migration, and the Caribbean. He's the author of Counter-Hegemony and Foreign Policy and co-editor of Race, Gender, and Culture in International Relations and Violence in the Third World in International Relations. A warm welcome and thanks to you all. So for today's time together, in terms of our schedule, we'll be hearing from Professor Mamdani for around half an hour. We will then hear from each of our discussants for around 10 minutes each, and then we hope to protect half an hour for Q&A, and we're very much looking forward to hearing the comments and questions from our large and diverse audience today. So without further ado, Professor Mamdani, if you're ready, I pass the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jones. To all those who are on this screen, I thank you for attending. I look forward to the remarks of my discussants. Over the next half hour, I will try and provide an overview of key arguments in Neither Settler Nor Native. This is a book about the nation state and about post-colonial modernity. The introduction opens with a discussion of the two phases of the nation-state, non-liberal and liberal. The nation-state was born in Iberia in 1492. Its agenda was summed up by a single slogan: one country, one people, one religion. This state project set fire to relations between majority and minorities within its boundaries, setting in motion processes of ethnic cleansing, specifically of Jews and Muslims. There followed a century of religious wars in Europe. This was the first, the non-liberal phase in the making of the nation-state. The liberal solution to religious wars was reflected in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Two key components of the modern state were born at Westphalia: religious tolerance at home and the reciprocal guarantee of sovereignty abroad. The liberal solution was theorized in John Locke's treatise on tolerance. Catholics can be tolerated if they renounce any political support of the Pope or of any power outside England. This is how Locke formulated the key tenet of the liberal theory of the nation-state. The liberal notion of the nation-state turned majority and minority into permanent political identities. Only the majority has sovereignty. The minority cannot participate in sovereignty. The notion of a sovereign majority alongside non-sovereign minorities is the original sin in the liberal theory of the nation-state. In this book, I explore the export of the notion of different kinds of citizens, sovereign and non-sovereign, from the US to South Africa and Germany, and finally to Israel. At the same time, the book explores the construction of an epistemological project that grounded the political distinction between sovereign and non-sovereign subjects in an epistemic and legal distinction. The distinction between religious groups was further developed into a civilizational difference between races and tribes. This development is explored in some detail in the chapter on Sudan. This is a book about the United States as a founding experience in modern colonialism. The first chapter explores the Indian reservation as the site where core institutions of modern colonialism were forged. It is also a book about extreme violence as a consequence of modern nation-state building in the post-colonies. Should we think of extreme violence as the consequence of a criminal project executed by individuals, no matter how numerous, following the criminal model popularized by Nuremberg and today upheld by the ICC? Or should we think of it as a political project, a notion born of the transition from apartheid in South Africa? What can we learn from the failure of denazification and the relative success of post-apartheid South Africa? Finally, the book asks, what is transportable in the South African experience? What does South Africa have to teach us? To answer this question, the last chapter takes a fresh look, a look through South African lenses at Israel-Palestine, the most intractable political problem in today's world. In this talk, I would like to comment on 4 issues. First, by taking the US as a case, I seek to compare the conquest of Indians and the domination of Africans, to distinguish between colonial conquest and racial domination as 2 different modern ways of subjugation, each with a radically different consequence. Second, what is the difference between an immigrant and a settler? Third, I suggest we think of 2 different ways of thinking of political identity, one as historical and changeable, and the other as natural and permanent. To historicize identity is to see it as born of a particular form of the state, and therefore is changeable. But to see identity, by which I mean political identity, as natural and thus permanent is to see it as a timeless expression of a trans-historical innate cultural self. Finally, I suggest that we decouple the nation and the state as we seek an alternative to the nation state. I shall begin with a discussion of American Indians and African Americans in the US. What's in a name? How should we call the pre-Columbian resident communities of the Americas? As Indian or as native? Indian is the name Columbus gave peoples of the New World. Though native is today considered a more politically correct designation, neither the US government nor the peoples they colonized embrace it. The museum dedicated to pre-Columbian era in Washington, D.C. is called the National Museum of the American Indian. What difference would it make if we were to call this museum the National Museum of the Native American and not the American Indian? Why is it that the 1964 Civil Rights Act did not apply to Indians in reservations, so that a separate Indian Civil Rights Act had to be passed in 1968? To be sure, the two acts are not the same. The 1964 Act is constitutionally binding, whereas the 1968 Indian Act is not. It is only advisory. Reservation Indians are not and have never been rights-bearing citizens of the US in a constitutional sense. There were no reservations before the United States. The reservation was a creation of the US. The reservation is geographically within the territory of the US, but it is a polity separate from the United States. The Europeans who came to America were not immigrants, they were settlers. What is the difference? Immigrants come to join existing polities, whether they seek equality or advantage in it. Settlers come to displace existing polities and establish their own exclusive sovereignty. Indian reservations are not part of the sovereign state we call the US. In the words of Chief Justice John Marshall, writing in mid-19th century, reservations are, quote, domestic dependent colonies. The term Indian tribal sovereignty, another politically correct phrase, in fact masks colonial domination. Legally, reservation Indians are wards of Congress. Reservation authorities are overseen by a vast federal bureaucracy known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The BIA is no different from the colonial bureaucracy that governed any indirect rule colony in Africa. The Indian reservation was part of a two-state solution. The two-state solution, a sovereign state alongside a non-sovereign protectorate, was Lincoln's contribution in the second half of the 19th century. Lincoln claimed to provide a permanent solution for Indians who had survived the genocide. Germany, after Nuremberg, also embraced a two-state solution. Instead of reintegrating Jews as equal citizens in a single state, as part of a one-state solution, post-Nazi Germany embraced the idea of a separate state for Jews after the Holocaust. The fact is that the Nazi project may have been defeated militarily, but it survived politically. The two-state solution gave a longer lease to the Nazi political agenda. The latest version of the two-state solution is in Israel-Palestine. In contrast to South Africa, where the native population was subordinated, majority of the population in Israel was expelled outside its borders, as it had been in the US when Indians were herded into reservations. America also originated the notion of differentiated citizenship, with only some participating in sovereignty. Until 1921, Indians were nationals but not citizens. After that, Indians had to be naturalized as citizens. They had first to be part as polities before they could be naturalized. Colonized Indians and African slaves had two different experiences in the modern era. Whereas their land was forcibly taken from Indians, Africans were forcibly taken from the land. Indians were colonized, Africans enslaved and dominated racially. the consequences have been radically different. Reservation Indians have a different relationship to the US from that of African Americans. Racial and colonial subjugation are not the same, even if racial discrimination may be common to both. Colonization refers to conquest of territory. The American Indian symbolized land which has been stolen. The African slave embodied captive and coerced labor. Politically, Indians were governed in a protectorate as part of a two-state solution. African slaves were racially segregated within a one-state polity and governed in thousands of separate plantation regimes. The one-state solution provided a political frame for the development of the struggle against Jim Crow and racial domination. Even if it proceeded by fits and starts, sometimes even receding, the one-state framework made possible the development of alliances. The two-state solution explains the continued isolation and colonial subjugation of the reservation Indian. We can see the big difference between the two in the US. The one-state solution has provided a political context for alliance building leading to a general emancipatory struggle. In contrast, the two-state solution has imposed isolation on an oppressed group by imposing on it a separate political home, a protectorate. Politically, a one-state solution is preferable to a two-state solution. The American model was exported to a number of places, among these South Africa, Germany, and Israel. South African settlers attained state independence in 1910. Settlers studied the North American experience on how Indians were governed. Three key elements of governance were imported to South Africa or exported to South Africa: homeland, traditional authority, and customary law. The starting point was the fiction that every tribe has a territorially contained homeland from time immemorial. The fiction of a homeland was actually a program to expel each tribe from the bulk of its historical lands. Second, it was claimed that every homeland has from time immemorial been administered by traditional authority, sanctioned by custom, and thus not subject to popular accountability. Finally, the obligation of this traditional authority, it was said, is to enforce a customary law on the homeland. The legitimacy of custom is that it too has been there from time immemorial. This time, though, settlers insisted that custom be excised of all practices or notions that settlers considered repugnant to civilization. I will discuss the lessons of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa after a discussion of Germany and Israel. South Africa was not the only place, it was not the only one that learned from the US. So did Nazi Germany and Hitler. Hitler drew two lessons from the US. One, that genocide is doable and therefore thinkable. Two, that there can be a second and third class citizenship, as of Puerto Ricans, African Americans, and Indians after 1921. Hitler appointed a committee of lawyers to study American citizenship laws. This background preparation led to the drafting of Nuremberg laws. This learning process has been documented in some detail by the historian James Q. Whitman of Yale University in his book, Hitler's American Model. Post-war denazification failed because the Allies shut their eyes to the political project that inspired and propelled Nazism. Nazism was a striving for a purified nation-state, one that would go beyond distinguishing the national majority from national minorities to purifying the nation by expunging it of all minorities. I argue that Nuremberg failed to root out Nazism politically. Unlike the criminal model, which understands violence as the result of antisocial acts of individual perpetrators, I focus on extreme violence as an outcome of collective mobilization against minorities in the nation state. Rather than individualize the violence as a standalone act, I point to cycles of violence sustained by groups mobilized as so many constituencies. Rather than catalog atrocities so as to name, shame, and punish its perpetrators, I seek to identify the issues around which constituencies are mobilized. Rather than exclude perpetrators from the political process, I seek to include them along with all those who survived, victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, bystanders. I use the term survivor differently from how it was used after the Holocaust or after the Rwandan genocide, not just to refer to surviving victims of extreme violence, but to all who survived extreme violence. Let me come to Israel and the US. Are Jewish people in Israel settlers or immigrants? The Jewish population of Mandate Palestine belonged to three groups. There were those who had never left. These were natives. There were those who returned on a pilgrimage seeking a religious homeland. They were content to be part of the existing polity. This was the first aliyah of immigrants. Then there were those who wanted their own exclusive polity, a Jewish nation state in place of the existing polity. They came in the second and third aliyah. These were the settlers. The Zionists striving for a nation state cannot be understood unless we also grasp the lesson they drew from Germany. Victims of the nation state project in Germany and in Europe, Zionists decided to set up a nation state in Israel itself. The Zionist state project has unfolded in two phases. The first reduced the Palestinians from a majority to a minority. This was the Nakba. The Zionist project has continued to demonize the minority that remained within its territorial boundaries as a demographic threat, demanding that their numbers be further cut down. In reality, the Nakba continues. Palestinians inside Israel do not participate in sovereignty. They have rights, even political rights, including the right to vote, but they do not participate in power. This vision has become clearer as the state project has been redefined, from Israel as a Jewish and democratic state to Israel as a Jewish state. I have already spelt out the significance of the debate on one state versus two-state solution. One state would be akin to direct racial domination, whereas a two-state solution would create a protectorate and lead to indirect colonialism under Zionist rule. The history of the African slave in America shows that a one-state solution is a better framework for building alliances and broadening the frame and depth of resistance. But to have a future, that resistance needs to look for a third alternative. I propose that we look at the South African transition of apartheid to glimpse the vision of a third alternative. I argue that the anti-apartheid resistance took a creative turn in the 1970s, leading to an epistemological and political breakthrough for the anti-apartheid movement. Before the 70s, anti-apartheid politics was largely derivative. It reproduced the architecture of apartheid. Each racial group organized separately, as defined by apartheid power. Africans as African National Congress, Indians as Natal Indian Congress, coloreds as Colored People's Congress, and whites as Congress of Democrats. By reproducing the architecture of apartheid inside resistance, resistance gave apartheid a natural flavor. The apartheid mindset was broken only in the 1970s. The key initiative came from the student movement, starting when black students led by Biko left the liberal white student organization, formed their own separate body, and went on to organize township dwellers, starting with Soweto. Left in the wilderness, radical white students turned to organizing hostile workers on the fringes of townships. Out of this experience was born an epistemological awakening that white and black are political identities, and that political identity is historical, not natural. Black, said Biko, is not a color. If you're oppressed, you are black. There was nothing inevitable about the impact of BC, that is, black consciousness, on the anti-apartheid struggle. BC could have led to a nation-state consciousness, claiming that South Africa is a black nation of the black majority, thus essentializing black as a trans-historical identity. Instead, it led to an epistemological awakening, the consciousness of black as a historical political identity. Afrikaners made a journey from being junior partners of British colonialism to being part of the anti-apartheid coalition. But there was no consensus. The South African moment was born in the 70s and 80s. There was a threefold shift in vision. From opposition to apartheid, it looked for an alternative to apartheid, rather than just turning the world upside down. It dared to think of a different world. From a state of the majority, the national majority, the black majority, it looked to create a state of all the people. From opposition to whites, it went on to oppose white power. The turning point was when apartheid forces reformulated the demand for black majority rule to non-racial rule. Rather than deny the existence of race as phenotypical difference, they refused to endow racial difference with a political significance. The first step to decolonizing the political was deracialization. The next step would be, or would have been, detribalization. Rather than deny the cultural significance of tribe as an ethnic group, detribalization would decouple the link between culture and territory, ethnicity and homeland, citizenship and identity, forged under colonialism. To do so would be to reverse the politicization of culture under apartheid through the creation of homelands, homeland authority, and customary law. The result would be to create a single citizenship, not multiple citizenships based on separate identifications, race in the central state and tribe in the homelands. 1994 created formal political equality in South Africa regardless of race. It has yet to create formal political equality in the former homelands regardless of ethnic identity. My claim is that a successful struggle for social justice will need to cut across the political divide imposed by race and tribe. Without political equality, the mobilization for social justice will be fragmented into so many races and tribes. 1994 was the birth of a new political community. Instead of a rupture into two separate communities, one of victims of apartheid and another of perpetrators, blacks and whites, which would have required a partition of South Africa. Let us not forget that in 1994, Afrikaners divided, with a minority asking for a homeland where Afrikaners would have their own state. The political community did emerge in 1994, and this was that of survivors of apartheid, not just victims who survived, but all survivors, whether victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, or bystanders. Apartheid power was not defeated. Neither did apartheid win. The situation in the mid-80s could only be described as a stalemate. Why then did apartheid agree to negotiate in 1990? Two considerations made captains of apartheid rethink their primary reliance on a military strategy. One, the possibility that anti-apartheid mobilization may spread from the townships to Bantustans. But more important was the second possibility, one that signaled the likelihood of an even more scary outcome. Boers realized that the hitherto pro-apartheid Boer intelligentsia was gradually beginning to abandon apartheid as a state project and look for an alternative. The principal critique of 1994 is that there was no social justice. This critique both states a truism and misses the political rebirth that did happen in 1994. I argue that we should see the rebirth as the beginning of political decolonization, without which the decolonization of society would be far more difficult. I'd like to begin with a note. This is on Israel-Palestine. I'd like to begin with a note on political Zionism. At the core of political Zionism is the effort to build not just a Jewish religious community in the Holy Land, but a Jewish state. Political Zionism seeks to erase the distinction between state and society. The conflation of society with state is the foundation of the nation state and its program of rule by a permanent national majority. The nation state may call itself a democracy, as Israel does, but this majority is not actually determined through political contestation. Rather, the majority is defined pre-politically, as it is the nation itself. The most the majority can hope for is a democracy for the majority, but not for all. But even majoritarian democracy remains a difficult project in Israel, because the state defines who can be a member of that majority. In other words, who is officially considered a Jew. The most fundamental of Israel's unanswered questions is who is a Jew. If Israel is to be a state for Jews only, it must answer the question of who is a Jew. Its answer cannot avoid flattening the diversity of world Jewry into the Jewry sanctioned by the state. At the legal level, this question has bedeviled Israeli authorities since the law of return was passed in 1950. Is a law defined by religion? Is a Jew defined by religion or by ethnicity? Are Jews members of a religious community or a nationality, or both? As a result, the State of Israel now has two legal definitions of who is a Jew. The narrow definition provided by halacha, the religious law, which Israel enforces in the sphere of personal affairs, and the broad definition in the amended law of return. At the political and social level, Judaization eliminates unacceptable forms of Jewishness. The acceptable form is associated with Ashkenazim, who trace their lineage to Yiddish-speaking parts of Europe. Ashkenazim were the founders of the state, who embraced the role of civilizers committed to bring other Jews into line with the national ideal. In particular, Ashkenazim have sought to civilize Mizrahim. The Mizrahim are Arab Jews. They present a special challenge to Zionism, for Zionism presumes that Arab and Jewish identity are both incompatible and indelibly hostile towards one another. Otherwise, there would be no need of a Jewish state in historic Palestine. Ashkenazi Israel has demanded of the Mizrahim that they renounce their Arab culture and embrace only their religion, Judaism. No wonder the Mizrahim have paid back by standing behind a religious Zionism that stands to the right of the Ashkenazim, politically sidelining it. For the Mizrahim, there are two political enemies, not one. Not only Palestinians, but also Ashkenazi Israel. In the Zionist worldview, Palestinians are Canaanites who never left home. They are squatters, not natives. With the return of the native after the Holocaust, the squatter must get out of the way and make room for the native civilized by 100 years past. The Palestinian resistance has led to multiple shifts in the Palestinian liberation movement. From an early focus on armed struggle and following the first and second Intifada, Palestinian mobilization in Israel and the occupied territories has moved to a demand for political change. The goal has been to undo the Jewish state and replace it with a state of all citizens. Israel's political response has been to fragment Palestinians into three disconnected groups: Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians in the occupied territories, and Palestinian refugees. The development of Palestinian consciousness straddling these three groups has been an outcome of a protracted process whose focus and center of gravity have shifted radically over time, from exile to home and from an all-or-nothing demand for Israel's disintegration to a demand for involvement in the Israeli political process. Organizationally, this has involved a threefold transition. At first, displaced Palestinians looked to Arab frontline states to be their protectors and liberators. After these Arab states were defeated in 1967, Palestinians turned to the nascent and exile-led PLO, an armed resistance movement. In 1982, Israel went to war in Lebanon. The brainchild of Ariel Sharon, then the defense minister, the Lebanon War was in fact a total war against Palestinians. The IDF deployed well over 120,000 troops for over 10 weeks. It was the country's largest mobilization since the 1973 war, according to the historian Rashid Khalidi. Outgunned and overwhelmed, the PLO withdrew to Tunis. But while the PLO was defeated, Sharon's strategic objective remained unrealized. Instead, the war intended to suppress Palestinian resistance only stoked it further. With the exiled armed resistance smashed, the moment was ripe for political mobilization at home. The first Intifada in the late 1980s crystallized the internalization of Palestinian leadership, and with it a definitive rejection of the failed armed resistance championed by the external leadership with mainly a refugee base. Arafat made two crucial compromises at Oslo. First, he tacitly accepted settlements in the West Bank. Second, he explicitly accepted Israel's stranglehold over the economy and sovereignty of the occupied territories, even going so far as to agree that this stranglehold would persist in a future Palestinian state. The Second Intifada, beginning in 2000, brought together Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories under a single movement. Both intifadas responded to the failings of the official PLO. The second in particular reflected frustration over the PLO's capitulation to Zionism at the Oslo Accords of 1993 and the onward rush of settlements that followed. The success of the Second Intifada led to mobilization under Balad, National Democratic Alliance, a political party then led by Azmi Bishara, a Palestinian MK, a Palestinian member of the Knesset. On May 21, 2001, Bishara proposed a new basic law aimed at achieving rights for Palestinians as a national minority. In the months that followed, Bishara presented another bill countering the false claim that Israel is a democratic state. It did so by asking the Knesset to rewrite that assertion in its basic law and instead affirm that Israel is, quote, a state of all its citizens. Whereas Bishara's first bill sought equal rights for the national minority, now he was asking the Knesset to reject the idea that Israel is a nation state, a state of the Jewish people, explicitly, thereby negating the existence of both the national minority and the national majority. Over the past decade, Palestinian politics has moved from an engagement predominantly internal to one predominantly external. The internal engagement called for a state of all its citizens as a counter to the Zionist project for a Jewish state. The external engagement takes the form of an international boycott of the Israeli state and society under BDS. To the extent that BDS calls for the de-Zionization of the State of Israel, there is reason to give it enthusiastic support. But to the extent that BDS seeks to extend the boycott to Israeli society and not just to its Zionist sectors, there is reason to be critical. BDS needs to learn from the very experiences it claims to build on, that is, the South African divestment and boycott during apartheid. The main problem with blanket boycotts is that they embrace a mirror image of the nation-state framework, which collapses state and society into one. By themselves, international boycotts are incomplete. The strategy of isolating the state internationally needs to be aligned with a domestic strategy to win over forces that are either indifferent or opposed to the Zionist state in the ongoing struggle to isolate its supporters. What
Excuse
can
me,
BDS?
Professor Mamdani, just to let you know you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What can be from the South African experience? First, the anti-apartheid struggle was not directed from a single center, but from multiple centers. Not only did the struggle include multiple initiatives, they were sometimes contradictory. Take the example of the anti-apartheid movement, which was directed from outside the country, and the internal political struggle, which demanded reform of the political process to allow the oppressed majority the right to participate in the political process. Whereas the anti-apartheid boycott made no distinction between South African state and society, calling for a boycott of both, the internal political struggle proceeded by building alliances with all sectors of white society, so long as they did not openly and actively support the apartheid state. Second, whereas BDS can contribute to Israel's international isolation, something more is needed if a non-Zionist alternative is to bloom in Israel itself. Like in South Africa, that something else is an epistemic revolution that will open the way to a political one. Phase 2 of the Palestinian moment will come when the same dynamic that leads to the unity of the oppressed also leads to the isolation of the oppressors. When it is not just the oppressed who seek political change, but also many of the current supporters of Zionist power. Getting there will require a new kind of political consciousness within Israel, a consciousness based on the recognition that the flourishing of Jews and Jewish life does not require a Zionist state, evidence being New York. It is this South African lesson that needs to be driven home to Israelis, as many as possible, that Jews do not need to have a Jewish state to have a secure home in Israel and Palestine. The lesson for BDS is that they need to build on the gains made by Balad. To do so would be to provide a political home for all anti-Zionists and even non-Zionist groups, Jews and Palestinians. Thank you very much. I'm done.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. Just having a problem turning my mic back on. Apologies for the delay. Thank you very much for that engaging and very detailed overview of your book. Of course, there may well be aspects that we can pick up on in the Q&A if you feel you haven't had adequate time to go through all of the details. But I would like now to pass to the first of our discussants, Dr. Todorova, if you're ready to begin. Thank you.
I'm ready indeed. Hopefully everyone can hear me.
We can hear you.
Thank you. I just want to say a very warm welcome to everyone and thank you to Professor Mamdani for the incredible opportunity to discuss his book, as well as thank you to Dr. Briony Jones and the Warwick Interdisciplinary Research Center for International Development for hosting this incredible event. I think it's a wonderful time to really begin to think through the question of decolonizing citizenship in light of finding ourselves in dark times. So the opportunity is wonderful, but in fact we find ourselves across the world in a historical moment, at least in my view, in a historical moment that we have retrenchant nationalisms and ethno-religious notions of citizenship across international politics and in the states that we'll be talking about today. So the way I have structured my contribution is partly as a reflection on neither settler nor native, but also I have a set of questions that I would like us to think through, to at least begin to think through, things that we can take forward in the future in relation to thinking about decolonial citizenship in settler colonies, but also I was very much inspired by reading the book in terms of beginning to think about decolonizing the political and decolonizing citizenship in other contexts as well, because of this notion of permanent minority. In fact, I found myself incredibly inspired by this idea that we actually need to begin to think of ourselves as permanent minorities wherever we find ourselves, precisely because we do not, in fact, neatly fit into any of the categories that are provided for us when we think about majority nationalisms. So in my own work, in my forthcoming monograph on decolonial solidarity, I very much speak about the necessity to develop a framework and a strategy for equal citizenship that moves away from exclusionary binary dichotomies that are based on ethno-national segregation. And for me, what I found, and I wish your book had been published a lot earlier because it would have been included in my own work, but there is always opportunity for future articles. Your work on decolonizing the political notion of citizenship is very much a concrete strategy and framework for thinking about the world beyond victims and perpetrators, and to begin to think about conceiving of cohabitation in a shared space as communities of survivors that are differentially, of course, related to a history of survival, but nevertheless communities of survival. And for this reason, I think what is incredibly important in relation to this concept is this idea of recentering residency. So this is something that myself, I have always done in my own political work with small p, as well as in my scholarship, is thinking about this idea of cohabitation as those who are here belong here, and that their rights and their ability to actualize themselves and to live their life is based on the idea that they're based in this particular space, rather than necessarily in relation to belonging to a particular kind of national community, however that may be defined. So for this reason, in the context of Palestine-Israel, where my own scholarship falls, I very much thought about this idea of decolonizing the political as something that calls for rethinking belonging on the basis of a commitment to residency. But that residency, of course, has to begin with thinking through the end of occupation and colonization. So to get to the notion of belonging on the basis of residency, the obstacles that fall in place need to be removed. And it is here, however, that I want us to actually think about a number of issues. So when I read your chapter, I fully agree with you. There are a number of questions I have. I thought it quite interesting that you focused on Israel within its 1948 borders, although you do speak of the dispossession in the occupied territories, and you speak about as well the diaspora that has resulted as a consequence of the dispossession of 1948 and 67, but it's always ongoing dispossession. People are leaving all the time because of the conditions under which they find themselves. And so in my own work, I have been very cautious of the fact that the right of return and its denial has to be central. So thinking about the way in which the right of return is denied has to be central to the way in which we think about countering dispossession and the colonizing notions of belonging, partly because, unlike some of the other contexts that you speak of in the book, that are very much premised on this idea of concentration and segregation within a very succinct polity, in contrast, the Palestinians find themselves actually dispossessed way beyond the borders of Palestine, historic Palestine, and Israel, outside of 48, outside of the 1967 occupied territories. And that diaspora, of course, is not allowed to return, and therefore it has found its claim to belonging to be constantly undermined. And this is one of the key tenets, in fact, of the BDS movement. I wasn't going to talk about the BDS movement, but I also want us to think about the way in which the BDS movement has not necessarily focused on isolating the state of Israel. On the contrary, my own experience of it is actually focusing, for example, on international complicity, both in terms of thinking about the beneficiaries in terms of other states, but also private corporations as well, that serve to undermine citizenship and to bolster colonization and occupation as well. So this is something I want to put forward as something that we need to acknowledge in that respect as well. So these are the two key issues. I mean, the main issue for me is how do we think through an insistence on the right of return is central to recentering, belonging, and physical residency as the key way in which we think about citizenship in the present moment. So this is quite significant. And of course, to think about those political strategies, and for me, it was very important that you actually ended on the note that I wanted to ask you about as I wrote this before we came in, which is this idea that this notion of residency and decolonizing the political, and this idea of, and I'm asking you to think about this notion, actually powerful notion of all of us thinking of ourselves as permanent minorities, actually, not just the role of the permanent minorities and the place of the permanent minorities, but all of us beginning to think of ourselves as permanent minorities. That requires a political strategy. So where do we go from the dream, the vision of equal decolonized citizenship, from the present moment, which actually finds itself very much in the space of segregation, of concentration, and a thinking about belonging in very binary terms and very exclusionary terms as well. And of course, you've begun with critiques of BDS. In my own work, actually, I argue that BDS very often is mischaracterized in all sorts of ways, even by those who might be sympathetic to it, precisely because it is asking us to think about the way in which we need to get from point A to B, i.e. from occupation to liberation and possible equality as a consequence of that. But I also wanted to extend my reflections in thinking about the way in which notion of permanent minorities may in fact help us to think through citizenship beyond just the settler colonial state, precisely because as you begin your book, you talk about the way in which we can think about citizenship as this kind of notion that the world has to be based on nations that are very concrete. In the immediate consequence of that colonial modernity and the colonial modern conceptualization of citizenship, it always produces exclusions, it always produces all of these others. And for this reason, of course, I've always thought about the question of migration. So I think it's really important for me when I think through settler colonial theory, sometimes I worry, and this is something your book actually refuses to do and does really well, I worry that the constant insistence on settler and native excludes the notion of the migrant as an idea that gets us to think about citizenship that is not one that insists on dispossessing other sovereignty, and embracing this idea that we're all here for a short period of time on this earth as individuals, and what we need to do is think about coexisting and cohabiting collectively in a space that means that we are always a unit. So the community is something that we build, is not something that we are born into. And this is why I think that your concept of permanent minorities actually has the potential to be something that is quite liberatory beyond just the context of settler colonies, and can be extended to other questions of thinking about citizenship, and particularly thinking about this in the context of the fact that I'm physically sitting in Brexit Britain. So this is quite amazing for all of us to be brought together in different contexts, and the way in which we're seeing this kind of entrenchment of ethno-nationalism, and all of that is giving rise to questions of, what does it mean to be British, etc., etc., etc. And of course, at the same time, we find ourselves in a situation where it is a tiny majority of people that in fact voted for this, and even those who voted for this are not sure what is it that they really wanted. And so what we're having is a political project that is driven by a minority that speaks on behalf of a majority. And this is how I have always thought about the way in which we also need to reconceptualize Palestine-Israel, in terms of reminding ourselves that actually it is a minority-driven project that claims to speak on behalf of a majority and collapses all of the complexities and distinctions that may in fact be an answer to living differently. So reclaiming our cultural differences in ways that are in fact more positive and more productive, acknowledging the fact that we speak different languages, and we practice even our faith in different kind of ways, and we have different sort of histories of where we come from, or even where we may end up being. And this is something that is often lost, the idea that actually people continue to move and end up in different places, and diasporas are always recreated at all different times. And of course, there is an issue that I can't take up at this point, because I do want to hear what others want to say, you yourself, how you would respond to some of these issues. But the role of diaspora itself is not always very straightforward. The way in which diasporas that are not physically located in the settler colonial spaces or the national spaces that we are thinking through, the way in which they relate to this concept of nationality, of belonging, of who gets to decide how the polity should be run and what the place should look like, even when they're not necessarily resident there. So I think that your book is incredibly provocative and inspirational in that sense. And there are certain things I would like us to think through further, but I also think that the concepts that you develop can be extended to a range of fields when we think about the world as one that is post-colonial, but also decolonizing, because the post-colonial is not fully here in that sense. So I thank you very much for this incredible opportunity, and I look forward to hearing what other esteemed colleagues have to say as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teodora. That's really, sorry, I have to restart my audio every time I do that. Thank you so much for those comments. They're incredibly helpful. I think at this point it would be useful to go straight to the comments of Randolph, if that's possible, and then we will open up the chat for people's questions and give Professor Mamdani a chance to respond to the questions that he would wish to engage with. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Mamdani. It's a great pleasure to be in the same panel with you, and thank you all for coming out to listen to our presentations today. Professor Mamdani has written yet another book that is theoretically sophisticated and rich in empirical texture. The scope of the work is such that I'm only able to offer a few general remarks and ask a few questions. I have 5 points. The first one is modernity all the way down. Modernity has had a checkered career, but throughout that career, it's been a central force in colonialism, in that it went beyond the extraction of economic value. It has also imparted the nation-state model, not only as the way of organizing state civil society, but also modernity as a paradigm of identity construction. The nation-state model emerged in Europe in two stages, but was most coherently expressed in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. It addressed problems specific to Europe, which were driven to a significant extent by an effort to solve problems of religious minorities. But Westphalia was simultaneously founded on a contradiction, namely that whereas the rights of minorities in Europe were constitutionally guaranteed contingent upon acceptance of loyal citizenship, the opposite transpired in the colony. In the colony, the settler produced the figure of the native, followed by what might be called policies of segregation by classification. The book works out both the grand strategy and the operational dynamics of transforming peoples into tribes and other subunits convenient for an admixture of rule, both direct and indirect. It is not that there were no tribes or regional identities before colonialism. It is that, according to Professor Mamdani, the Europeans politicized these identities in a larger strategy of political control. These identities were used by the colonizer to penetrate, organize, and manage territories and peoples, done quite effectively by manipulating customary law, combined or rather subsumed into settler civil law. The American settler system of reservations was just such an ingenious innovation, built as it were by the invention of the native as a legal category as distinct from a citizen, and then the use of instruments such as the doctrine of discovery to acquire land. The British, for their part, invented the Arab, non-Arab split in Sudan, something that would eventually lead to genocide. The South African sent experts to study the US reservation system in the 1920s to prepare for an apartheid state. And finally, in 1948, Palestinians have either been subjugated as an internal minority in Israel or territorially quarantined into permanent statelessness. Modernity's most enduring accomplishment is its technology of governance in the form of the nation state. It needs to be fundamentally re-examined, according to Professor Mamdani. My second point, permanent minorities and majorities. The making of minorities and majorities was and still is a preoccupation of coloniality. The post-independence period has shown a dogged adherence to the nation state and development models bequeathed by colonial rule. It is paradigmatic. Here, in my view, is one of Mamdani's most compelling contributions. Rather than take these categories like nation state, native, settler, immigrant, minorities, majorities as givens, neither settler nor native historicizes their conditions of emergence, paying attention to the world order pressures of empire and imperialism, exerting downward pressure on state formation, as well as the balance of social forces within these social formations. We should not underestimate Mamdani's insight that colonial domination is not possible without innovation, or perhaps even some measure of genius. In South Africa, for instance, the strategy behind apartheid state formation was based on racism, but race itself was partly put to the side as a classifying instrument. Rather, they resorted to tribes and tribalism. In a previous book, Citizen and Subject, Mamdani puts it this way: racism compounded rather than eased the problem of rule in a colonial context, for its thrust was not to divide and rule, but to unite and rule. Against this, tribe as an organizing category had the following advantages. Unlike race, tribe would dissolve the majority of the colonized into several tribal minorities. Furthermore, tribal identity would be argued to be both natural and traditional. In the United States, of course, the enactment of the tribe was conjoined with the construction of the figure of the native, and reciprocally the settler as immigrant. My third point, criminal violence versus political violence. Violence, including extreme violence, has always been an integral aspect of modernity. Founding violence was critical to the acquisition of territory and simultaneously the hierarchical respecializations of persons and communities. A crucial distinction is made between criminal and political violence. Criminal violence treats violence as individual acts with individual responsibility. Political violence is systemic, ideological, and locked into modernity because it is central to the making and maintenance of permanent minorities and majorities. The Holocaust was a mass enactment of a political project, not the deranged act of discontented individuals. Nuremberg was the most dramatic instance of transforming political violence into criminal violence. This mistake has been repeated numerous times in places devastated by violent political conflict. Neither settler nor native provides a way out of this trap. The solution is for a project of decolonization of the political. Decolonizing the political would go beyond finding the guilty ones for shaming or punishment. I will skip a little bit here now and go to my fourth point, decolonizing the political. Let me quote Professor Mamdani because he offers a different way in how we think about decolonization, and I quote, "Only when the political system is decolonized, that is, when identities are uncoupled from permanent majority and minority status, will it be able to secure equity." Stated differently, and again quoting from neither settler nor native, Mamdani writes, "Decolonization, the counterpoint, is the unmaking of the permanence of these identities." The argument is inspired by developments surrounding the end of apartheid. Unlike Nuremberg, South Africa treated apartheid as a violent system of political domination rather than one of criminal excesses of human rights violations perpetrated by state personnel. What Mamdani does not want to do is to follow the Nuremberg path, which ended up in failed denazification. I will move on a little bit here. By contrast, the South African way upsets the minority-majority model in political and constitutional terms. A negotiated settlement took place. They spared the country what at one time looked like a bloodbath waiting to happen. No one was criminalized. The solution was based on political innovation. I have some questions and observations. Firstly, I would like to hear a bit more about the South African gambit. The introduction of neither settler nor native, where the South African route is laid out as worthy of emulation, is rather different, quite different in Chapter 3, where there's a good deal more circumspection about the aftermath of 1994. The strength of the claims on decolonizing the political also tapers off. There is admission that, quote, they tried with incomplete success to destroy the settler and the native by reconfirming both as survivors. I now ask, could any practice of decolonizing really would have erased and reinscribed white South Africans as immigrants? It is fair to ask about the progress of this aspect of the double survivor model. The tribal paradigm is actually still there. And even if there has been some inroads against the politicization of race, is it not true that the white population had to be given a mulligan or two in order to come to the table? As late as the 14th of April 1994, 12 days before the national elections, Mr. de Klerk was making it sound like it was his party that ended apartheid. And Mangosuthu Buthelezi was playing games at being on the ballot, the latter all in the name of tribal politics. The skirmishes between the ANC and Inkatha reached serious levels both before and after 1994. Secondly, are we sure we want some survivors to become immigrants? In South Africa, we want settlers to be recasted as immigrants, but in the United States, we want immigrants to be recasted or reframed as settlers. I need this to be clarified. In both countries, immigrants are subject to widespread violence. In South Africa, Asians, some of whom have been their foreparents for more than 150 years, have been attacked and actually because they are immigrants. And secondly, African immigrants from surrounding states are being violently attacked. South Africans insist on their national sovereignty, even against those in the frontline states that paid a heavy price in toppling apartheid itself. The violence in South Africa against immigrants is not random, yet it is treated as criminal behavior rather than acts of political discontent leading in the other direction of decolonization of the political. The scope of the problem is such that the government of South Africa had to intervene in 2019 in their National Action Plan, in which there were serious concerns expressed about the treatment of immigrants. Thirdly, in the subsection, Is Apartheid Over?, it is argued that the critique of the new regime, that is the post-1994 period, is misplaced because it would have taken a revolution to bring about widespread social justice, but there was no revolution given the balance of social forces. Yet the NAP report goes on well beyond the pace of social justice. The general structure of the society in all areas of human security show among the worst inequalities in the world. The report is clear that, quote, the scars of colonialism and apartheid are indeed still visible on the collective face of South African society today. Poverty and underdevelopment are racially based, affecting mostly Black persons, while wealth, ownership, and a better life largely remain in the preserve of white persons. Racism, xenophobia, hate crimes and other intolerances, and Afrophobia make up 70% of the complaints discovered during the research for the National Action Plan. Mandli, I will skip a little bit here and come to my conclusion because I know time is of the essence. The questions of social justice, economic inequality, poverty, racially constrained opportunities for Black South Africans, anti-immigrant violence, and Afrophobia are all of the utmost urgency. Must be dealt with. Measuring the effects of the decolonization of the political in South Africa is technically difficult. But more than that, I understand after a long lingering trauma, the people want to see punishment, if not revenge. It is a difficult path to sustain. The punishment model has not worked so far. The challenge that the book presents is practical and actionable, but more on the time of a Brodelian longue durée. The time frame of the journalist wouldn't work. Decolonizing the political means nothing less than reimagining forms of state-societal relations that are not dependent upon the subjugation of a minority as a condition of possibility for political stability. I'll just wrap up by reading the very last paragraph. Mamdani does not dismiss, well, there's a whole story here about Mohawk, three Mohawk persons not being allowed back into Canada. And Audrey Simpson bills this as a moment, this refusal as a moment of some kind of liberation. Mamdani does not dismiss the matter, but cautions that such celebrations of agency and survival mistake the circumstance Indians face and reinforce the United States' denial about its colonial condition. This observation about agency is in sync with one of my own recent problems with some strands of critical theory, namely that resistance is the known destination where all credible analysis or deconstruction must end up. Quite some time ago, Stuart Hall called for a politics without guarantees, one where one's politics could not be read off the body. Mamdani issues that challenge again, only this time with a well-elaborated theory of getting there. And I'll leave it there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. If you could perhaps mute yourself and then the echo, sorry. There was a timing issue there. Thank you so much for those comments, for both of those discussant comments. I think they really show how the book echoes beyond, in effect, the original boundaries that Professor Mamdani set for himself in terms of his contributions. I think that was really important. Thank you. We have a question in the chat. Just to let everyone know that we'll do the Q&A via the chat function. And if you haven't seen this already, at the bottom right-hand side of your screen, there's a little purple arrow. If you click on that, you can select the chat function, which is the speech bubble to the left-hand side there at the bottom. And we have one question here already from Jane Poyner, who asks whether, in realizing the one-state solution for Palestine-Israel, what process is needed to get to the two sides around the table? Would you advocate a TRC like that instituted in South Africa? You've written about the necessary political compromise entailed in this process. And if the one-state solution is achieved, how do we ensure that ordinary Palestinians see real material changes? And a second question from Densur Munford. What's the difference between deracializing politics and liberal notions of racial blindness? What do you believe differentiates these two moves? Because there are some who might argue that the answer to delinking race from citizenship is to stop talking about race and just move on. Now, along with those two questions, along with the questions already posed by the discussant, are of course already relatively substantial. So perhaps at this point, Professor Mamdani, I would give the floor back to you if you'd like to pick up on any of the threads or questions that are of particular interest to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Yeah. This is a feast. And as with any feast, you have to be careful not to try and take in everything. Decide what it is to engage with now and what it is to save for later. And I'll do that because there's no way I can engage with everything. This wonderful smorgasbord, which my colleagues have put on the table. So the first question, should we think of all of us as permanent minorities? I want to think more about it, but my first response is skeptical. Because permanent minority, the distinction between permanent majority and permanent minorities is a distinction embedded in law, reproduced through state policy based on systematic privilege for that group which has been defined as a majority, and systematic underprivilege for those described as minorities. So there's something structural about it. And I think that structural undergirding needs to be addressed. And the question is how to address it, when to address it. I agree completely that the right of return is crucial. And I agree that if we are going to give the necessary weight to the right of return, we need to think of not just the citizen, but the migrant. Now, although I didn't write this in the book, but I've increasingly, through these series of talks, I'm beginning to think that the notion of citizenship is hugely problematic. Citizenship goes with those who are not citizens on the same territory. And my ambition is to get us to think of residency, as you recognize. But we need to recognize that to think of residency, we need a conceptual language other than citizenship and other than sovereignty. Both of these are highly problematic terms in my view. After all, the migrant is set up against the citizen. And after all, citizenship goes with certain structurally reproduced privileges and migrancy with disprivileges. BDS. I wouldn't describe myself as a critic of BDS. I would describe myself as in critical engagement with BDS. I am deeply aware of the contributions of BDS. And as you say, the contribution is very much to highlight the complicity of the international community with what is going on inside Israel. But BDS also calls for divestments. BDS also calls on us to boycott. And I am asking for a highly political and analytical distinction between different tendencies within Israel, within the Jewish population in Israel. And I'm asking us for the BDS's strength. Is how it intends to come to grips with the external. What BDS needs, I think, to think through much more is the internal. I am firmly convinced, through the South African example, that fragmenting, the strategy of apartheid, the strategy of Zionism has been to fragment the colonized and at the same time to build unity around the colonizer. Any strategy of emancipation has to do the reverse, to chip away at the unity around the colonizer, to be deeply sensitive to even the smallest difference within that gap. After all, the 70s, the radical white students who got involved in hostile mobilization were a couple of handfuls. They were not large numbers. There were a couple of handfuls. From the 70s to the early 90s, it's almost 2 decades, over which they began to exemplify to the white population an alternative politics. Let me come to my second discussant. So the questions are mainly on South Africa. Let me give an example. In 1994, during the elections, one of the most sensitive questions in South Africa was, who can vote? Who should be allowed to vote in these elections? Citizen or immigrant also? The labor from Mozambique, from Lesotho, from a number of other, surrounding countries, had been hugely important in the trade union movement, especially in Fossatu, but also significantly in Cosatu a decade later. Their mobilization was strong enough that the option which won out was actually the translation of ANC's Freedom Charter. South Africa belongs to all those who live in it. So not only citizens, but migrants also voted. Inkatha Freedom Party and Gatsha Buthelezi, in the dispensation after 1994, took control of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Gatsha Buthelezi became the Minister of Internal Affairs. From then on, the entire program of this party was to deepen the split between the migrant and the citizen, to chip away at rights of migrants, to portray the migrant as responsible for the deepening inequalities in South Africa. And it is remarkable, this xenophobic violence began in the 1990s, but kept on growing. And what is remarkable is that xenophobic violence in South Africa was not against the racial stranger. It was against the tribal stranger. I mean, nobody would have believed it 10 years before, that black South African citizens would have targeted black migrants from across the border and taken it as natural that whites are part of that society. Nobody would have believed that. Everybody would have thought that if there was going to be large-scale violence, it would be against whites. I think this shows the importance of what kind of political project is put in place. There was no detribalization. The heart of tribalism as a political strategy in each Bantustan is to divide the population of the Bantustan. The entire population is black. To divide the population into natives and settlers. Those who belong ethnically as natives those who don't as settlers. It's the reversal of in white South Africa, where in South Africa outside the Bantustans, where the settler is privileged, the native is not. Here in the Bantustan, it's the reverse. The native is privileged, the settler is not. The native has customary rights. The non-native, the immigrant, dubbed as settler, does not have. Last point. Sure. South Africa has the worst inequality, amongst the worst in the world. I remember when I was at the University of Cape Town, the UN issued a report which showed that if you took white South Africa, per capita income of white South Africa, it would be 14th in the world, next to Spain. And if you took the per capita income of black South Africa, it would be 144th in the world, after Congo. It's terrible. My concern is not whether social justice should be a priority or not. It should be a priority, but my concern is with a mobilization which would be equal to tackling this priority. A mobilization which would not wreck on racial and tribal divides, which is why I argue that the first priority has to be the political project, which would create the basis of a mobilization that cuts across race and tribe. Two questions from the audience. Does Israel need a TRC? No, definitely not. I argue definitely not at this point. I argued in the South Africa chapter that TRC mimicked Nuremberg, with one difference. Nuremberg was crime and punishment. TRC was crime and forgiveness. But TRC never saw apartheid as a political project. TRC saw only agents of apartheid as criminals. Let's remember, crime is against the state. The state cannot commit a crime. Only agents of the state can commit a crime. I am interested in identifying extreme violence which is the result of a state-based mobilization, which extends into society. Right? The TRC would never bring us there. I'm not really interested in identifying individual perpetrators in Israel and taking them to ICC. That can be done some other time. I am interested in identifying what the state of Israel represents. Today in South Africa, at least every time I've been there, I have not heard any demand for punishment, but I have for social justice. Finally, I also agree that there are two pitfalls: racial blindness, not two pitfalls, but racial blindness. When does it turn into racial insensitivity? Look, it's similar to the question of affirmative action, right? At what point does affirmative action go beyond righting of wrongs to revenge? This has been the big debate in the US, and this has been used to end affirmative action. My only point is that affirmative action needs to go beyond the individual. It needs to be an institutional program. Reparations needs to be institutionalized, not a neoliberal version where you give a paycheck to every individual. No, it'll never work. At any point, it'll be too little. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have actually just perfectly come to the end of the time we've allowed for today's lecture. So apologies to those few questions that we weren't able to get to, although they are recorded in the chat for others to have a look at. So it really just leaves me with the job of once again giving a very warm thanks to Professor Mamdani for coming and sharing the session with us today, for giving the inaugural annual lecture of the Warwick Interdisciplinary Research Centre for International Development, and to our two discussants for the time and commitment they showed in their engaging and really probing questions and comments to Professor Mamdani. So please do look at in the chat. Maeve has posted up the link both to Professor Mamdani's book and also to allow you to sign up for our Research Centre's newsletter and Twitter if you'd like to sign up and follow further events. So I thank you all and wish you a good rest of the day, morning or evening, depending on where you're joining us from, and look forward to seeing you at future WICID events. Thank you very much.